Alright guys, so this is the lesson for April 7th, 2020. Still with Unit 1, two different key concepts though. So 1.4 has to deal with state building in the Americas, and 1.5 is state building in Africa. So like always, let's go ahead and get started. Early state building in the Americas is traced somewhere between roughly about 700s and the 1500s. The very first large-scale civilization that was discovered in North America probably popped up around this time. It was known as the Mississippian civilization. It started in the valley of the Mississippi River, and then it spread eastward, therefore again being known as Mississippian culture. They are noted for their mound building. So if you look at the picture there, you can actually see what looks like homes on top of these big giant earthen mounds. Sometimes they are probably, or they think that they're estimated somewhere anywhere between 100 feet tall and as wide as 12 football fields. And this would have been the civilization, not just one individual mound. So don't think like each one, no. The entire civilization, which I'll show you on the next slide as well. They're pyramid shaped, they're oval, sometimes they were shaped like animals. There's one in Wisconsin that's actually shaped like a man, and there's no real clear explanation for this because we don't have a lot of records that they left behind. The only thing that they did leave behind were these big giant mounds, and so we know that for some reason or not they were important to this civilization. They did practice large-scale agriculture because they are located in a river valley technically. The soil of the river valley has a lot of nutrients and it's very fertile for growing things, and we have evidence of them possibly growing corn, beans, squash, tobacco, and those were probably their main crops. Each town was built around a plaza, so the plaza was like the center. And then each of these plazas also had more than one earthen mound. And so the picture that you guys see there is what is from a state historical site in Collinsville, Illinois. That is because the largest town that was discovered of this Mississippian culture was known as Cahokia, which is present-day Illinois. Obviously, all of those things that you see on the picture are not there today. It's what they think the entire civilization would have looked like if they had recreated it to scale. So we know that somewhere around 1250, their population was estimated to be around 40,000 people, which is a lot for this time period and this era. It was a trading city. They traded things like clay, pottery, and engraved shells. They also made goods from stone, leather, wood, feathers, and copper. Another cool thing is that crafts were found that were made of bear's teeth from the Rocky Mountains and turtle shells from the Gulf of Mexico. In terms of location, Rocky Mountains are more toward the north of them, and the Gulf of Mexico is much more to the south of them, so that we know that if there's evidence of these items being found in this area, then obviously they did have to trade with cultures from different parts of the world. So there was interaction going on, even though there was people to the north of them, people to the south of them. They did have to trade and kind of somewhere maybe meet in the middle in order to get some of these luxury goods, or these goods that they probably would have considered luxury goods at the time. Their religion, society, and their decline. So they did practice what is known as animism, which is the idea or the belief that the natural world is filled with spirits. So everything has a spirit, everything is alive in nature, the water, the wind, the rocks, everything. They also did have a very strict or a rigid class structure. They had a chief. His name was the Great Sun. The Great Sun would rule each of these large towns. Beneath that, there was a group of upper class priests, and then the nobles, and then the common people, and then at the very bottom were slaves. Another interesting thing is that women actually did most of the farming. The men were more of the government type of positions, or held the government types of positions, and were the soldiers, while women did the gathering, if you will. Also, what we see with the Mississippian culture is that they were a matrilineal society. So I've mentioned this word before and I've talked about it before. Because it was very difficult at the time to determine paternity, which means who genetically or biologically their father was. A lot of the times, the responsibilities and the lineage, the line of succession, who's next in line to be in charge, is going to fall with the mother's child, because it's very, very hard to deny who your natural born mother is. And so a lot of the times when the Great Son would die, it would not pass to his son, it would pass to the son of his sister. He and his sister share the same blood, and therefore it's a guarantee that that blood is going to pass through to his sister's children, and therefore the genetic line carries on, or the genetic line of succession carries on. Somewhere around 1450, Cahokia was abandoned. That's pretty much right before the Europeans arrive, and there's no real clear reason why. We don't really know. Some people may think of flooding, some people say other types of extreme weather, crop failures, or disease, but for whatever reason, this civilization just completely disappeared. And then let's talk about the Olmecs. So the Olmecs are considered a pre-Columbian civilization of Mesoamerica. Pre-Columbian, we mentioned that pre-Columbus, before Columbus. They're estimated somewhere between 1200 and 400 BCE, so they're one of the older ones. Their fundamental patterns would later be adopted by different types of American Indian cultures of Mexico and of Central America, specifically the Maya and the Aztec. And that's because the Olmecs are considered like the mother civilization. What ended up happening is, I'll show you on a map. I always say that, I apologize. But on the next slide, I'll show you on a map. For some reason, the Olmecs split. They divided. And the Aztecs people are going to be the people that decided to go north, and the Maya are going to be people that decided to go south. So for whatever reason, there was disagreement between the two, and they separated and they went north and then they went south. The Nawa name for these people is Olmectal, which means rubber people. That is because they were great at extracting latex from Panama rubber trees. They would mix it then with vine juice to create rubber, so they were the rubber people. They also created large earthen pyramids, platforms, and monumental stone carvings. Probably most notable, they are famous for leaving behind 17 huge stone heads. These heads had flat faces, full lips, and they were wearing helmet-like headgear. So you can see from the picture there, they were thought to be the images of the Olmec rulers, because anytime somebody is a ruler or somebody is important or in charge, they usually want to leave a lasting memory of themselves as a memorial or as a way to symbolize how powerful they are. And so it's believed that these were the Olmec rulers of the time. Don't confuse these heads with the ones of the Easter Island eggs. Oh my god, I'm thinking Easter. The Easter Island heads are the ones like from the movie Night at the Museum, when he's like Dum Dum with the Gum Gum. Those are a little bit different. These are Olmec, those are Easter Island, so different types of heads. They did have a writing system. We know this because they discovered what was known as the Cascajal stone, which dates around somewhere roughly 900 BCE. It is the oldest version of writing in the Americas. So that's pretty unique and pretty cool to this culture. They also did develop a very wide trading network. Anywhere between 1100 and 800 BCE, they traded with peoples in the Northwest Valley of Mexico and then also in southeast parts of Central America. So here on the map is the division that I was talking about. So if you look on it, you can kind of see this split in the middle, if you will. So the orangey colors, tan colors, are going to be what end up being parts of the Aztec civilization, Aztec empire. So they would migrate or move towards the part of like the northern part of Mexico, and the people who move towards the south, towards the Yucatan Peninsula, are going to be of Mayan origin. And so we'll talk a little bit more about those cultures in a minute. The Olmecs, as far as land and agriculture goes, they set up near a territory known as San Lorenzo. Later, it'd be known as Tenochtitlan. They grew corn and beans as well. Their religion was a little bit complicated. We don't actually know the names of any of the specific gods that they worshipped or believed in. However, we will see an evolution of those gods. So because the Olmecs are considered a mother civilization for the Mayan and the Aztec peoples, eventually the gods of these two groups, we know that they originated from somewhere. They had to get their foundation or their basis from somewhere. And so you're going to see a lot of similarities between the gods from these two different groups because they drew from what they knew from the Olmecs. So, for example, you have Kukulkan for the Maya, and you'll have Quetzalcoatl for the Aztecs, and I'll show you what they look like on the next slide. The one that I have there is actually supposed to be a jaguar god. Jaguars and eagles were given very, very special significance. They were considered pretty high at the top of the food chain, and therefore mostly like predators, I guess you can kind of say, were revered or respected because of the fact that they were predators, and so they're at the top of the food chain and they got to be important. And so these are kind of sacred, special animals for these groups of people. So on the left, you have the... I lost my train of thought. Let me move myself here so I can move to the middle because I'm going to look a little bit weird. We're still learning, guys. So on the left, you actually have the Mayan god, Kukulkan, who is depicted almost a serpent, dragon-like, if you will. And then on the other side, you have the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl, who also is depicted as a winged or a feathered serpent. They look very, very similar, again, because they have origins from the same place. So let me go to the next slide, and let me move back myself again. Okay. All right, so now we get to the Aztecs, also known as the Mexica. It's pronounced with an SH and not Mexicas. That is because of the way the language is spoken. The Aztecs are going to be hunter-gatherers that migrated to central Mexico from the north in about the 1200s. They would eventually found their capital at Tenochtitlan. There is a story behind that. If anybody's seen the Mexican flag, there's a symbol in the middle. It actually has an eagle eating a snake on top of a cactus. That is because, according to the legend, whenever the Aztec people saw this, they were supposed to kind of stop their migration movement, and that's where they were supposed to settle, and that's where they did settle. And it happened to be the Tenochtitlan, which is present-day Mexico City, I believe. Over the next 100 years, they would conquer the surrounding peoples in this area, and they would create a very, very large empire stretching from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Pacific Ocean. The picture that you guys have there, I talked about it in class too. It's a story. Aztecs were really, or placed a lot of emphasis on their warrior groups. Being a warrior, being a soldier in this group was the highest kind of achievement that you could get. And so the story goes is that this warrior goes off into battle. He leaves his young, I guess, girlfriend behind. And some people say that they didn't want them to be together. Her father didn't want them to be together. A jealous lover or somebody else from her side didn't want them to be together. So he goes off to war. And then there's a story, there's different versions of it, but in the most common version is that she gets told that he dies in battle, and then she dies of a broken heart. And then he actually doesn't die in battle. He returns back home, and he figures out that she is dead. So he takes her body up to the mountain, and he's really angry, and he curses the gods. And as kind of like a way to make up for the situation, they let them rest eternally. So they turn her into a mountain known as the Sleeping Woman. And he becomes a fiery volcano right next to her. So in Mexico, in landscapes, you can actually see these two next to each other. Pretty sad, but that's according to the story. There's different versions of it, different legends of it. So the capital of the Aztecs, it was chosen uniquely for, yes, obviously the prophecy of the snake and the eagle, but also its location. So they used geography for protection and defense. The city itself is on an island in the middle of a swampy lake, so they're going to be able to see anybody coming to attack them if need be. It did grow into population somewhere around 200,000 people, and in the center of their village, or city, or town, I should say, they actually built what's known as the Great Pyramid, or Pyramid of the Sun. And I'll show you what it looks like on the next slide. They built also other pyramids, temples, and palaces that were made of stone. These people knew specifically what they were building, and so they thought it out. It was very well planned. Architecturally speaking, it was perfect, almost, if you will. They spaced everything out, everything aligned with the sun. Everything had to be mapped out in a certain way. There was avenues, there was routes, there was one pyramid mirroring the other pyramid, a place for the priest, a place for the people to live, and all these different things. And so again, not just done like winging it. They thought this out very skillfully and with a lot of detail. Their agriculture, they were famous for Lake Texcoco. They built these floating gardens known as chinampas to increase the amount of space for food production. So on the picture, you can actually see the chinampas above there. The earth basically floats above the ground, and so it's kind of almost self-irrigating, if you will. They also dug ditches to use lake water to help irrigate their fields and then to drain other parts of the lake for more fertile land. They used plant and animal waste as fertilizer. They built stone terraces on the sides of surrounding mountains to prevent soil erosion. They harvested trees to provide wood for fires and building materials. And the crazy thing, guys, is that they used only hand tools. They also didn't have any pack animals. So all of this was done with just manual labor and elbow grease, if you will, just the roughness of them using their hands and their physical nature to get the job done. The terraces that you guys see there, they also built that for irrigation because it's almost, again, a way to self-irrigate, and it does help prevent soil erosion. So I talked about that. Their economy and their society, as they conquered much of the area, they developed a tribute system. And so the Aztecs would conquer a people. They would take some people as payment. They would also take land. They would force some of the slaves to serve in the military, and then any goods or valuables were distributed among the noble class. Local leaders were able to stay in their position of power as long as they served as tribute collectors, so essentially like tax collectors. They got to keep their job if they made sure the people that were conquered paid their debts. They also grouped city-states into provinces. They moved warriors and their families to each of these provinces' capitals to make sure that the territory remained under Aztec rule. So it was kind of like a way to keep an eye on everybody, and it worked for them. Their government was a theocracy, which basically means it's a mixture of political leadership as well as religion combined together. At the very top was the emperor, known as the Great Speaker. Then you have the landowning nobles who formed most of the Aztec military leadership. Remember I said that they placed a lot of emphasis on military or on soldiers. Then you have the scribes and the healers. Scribes are like the writers, probably the scholars. Craftspeople and traders who operated what was known as the Pochteca, which is like the market or the trading areas. Then you have the peasants and the soldiers, just your regular foot soldiers, not anybody who's high-ranking military. And then lastly, you have your slaves. Aztec people could be enslaved too. They didn't just limit this practice to foreigners. If you were an Aztec person and you could not pay your debt or you had committed a crime, then you were also sold into slavery, if you will. And slaves were used for labor and sacrifices. So there I kind of have the visual of what that looks like. The social hierarchy, which I already described to you. King, priests, nobles, peasants. Merchants and artisans, and then peasants on the bottom. Okay, so the two pictures that I have there depict ritualistic human sacrifice. When you mention Aztecs, it's really hard to differentiate or separate the two in sentences. These are drawings that were left behind. However, I always like to throw different perspectives in there. Let me take a pause. So it's a little bit difficult because a lot of what we know about this early history of the Aztecs is European translated. So it's what was told to us from a European standpoint. A lot of the original Aztec text was destroyed. And so what we know about them being these bloodthirsty savages is what we get from a European viewpoint or a European standpoint. And so, yes, they did have these ritualistic sacrifices. The heart actually had to still be beating when it was taken out. Pretty nasty. But is it skewed or is it depicted to show them as these bloodthirsty savages? We don't actually know because a lot of their history was completely wiped out and erased when the Europeans are going to arrive later in the Americas. So did they practice it? Yes. Is it as gruesome or as horrific as it's depicted? We don't know. But we do know that they have found mass graves. People have been found bound, tied up, and mummified in other cultures as well. And so we know it's a pretty dark time in the Aztecs' history also. Religion. Let me move myself here so I don't block this view here. Okay. Their religion was extremely intricate and complex. It was also very key and central to their society. Their religion is also a mixture of their politics. They're a theocracy, so a lot of it has to be blended and joined together. They did worship a pantheon of hundreds of different deities or gods, so pantheon is basically like a huge giant collection, very similar to the way like the Greeks would. They have a god for pretty much everything. Some of the more famous ones, you have Huitzilopochtli, who was the god of the sun god and the war god. You have Quetzalcoatl, who was the god of wind and knowledge. And then I wanted to include one in there, even though she is going to probably be more important later when we talk about syncretism, is Tontantzin. Tontantzin, she's the mother goddess, or known as our revered mother. And if you notice, I put in parentheses the Virgin Mary and actually put them side by side to there. The people of Mexico tend to have a very, very strong connection to the Virgin Mary or the Virgen de Guadalupe. It is said that she has appeared to the people of Mexico several times. Famous stories surrounding Juan Diego, who happens to be an Indian in this area. He wants a church to be built on this mountain on Tepeyac Hill because the Virgin Mary appears to him. It's very unique the way that the Virgen de Guadalupe, Virgin Mary, appears to him because she's depicted, her skin color is darker, her hair is darker. She's wearing a brown/black belt around her waist, which would have been symbolic of an Aztec princess who was with child. there's a lot of references and symbolism that tries to tie her and this Tontanzin together, and that is because when, again, the Spaniards came and colonized the territories, they wanted it to be easier for the Indians to accept Christianity, and so they did tie them very, very closely together because they wanted the people to convert a lot easier, to shift over a lot easier. So you're going to see a lot of references between the two of them also. Their worship of these gods included many feast days, many rituals, and also human sacrifice. They believed that human sacrifice was necessary. They believed that a blood sacrifice was required as a form of repayment and as a way to atone for sin, to ask for penance or forgiveness from the gods. So, the decline of the Aztecs, it's pretty basic. The Europeans showed up. When the Europeans showed up, the Aztecs had extremely low-level technology. Agriculture was very, very hard on them. Everything was done by hand. The Aztec commitment to military and the constant need for more human sacrifices actually forced the leadership to expand territory so that it could not govern it. And so they were too spread out. They didn't have a communication. They didn't have technology. And there was a lot of resentment of this upper class because the upper class didn't have to pay taxes. Their people were never sacrificed. They didn't have to work. They didn't have to pay tribute, like I said. And so the peasants are going to become extremely hateful and resentful of this fact. When the Europeans arrived, they had all they needed to do to rebel. And on top of that, the Europeans also brought with them a whole bunch of diseases that pretty much wiped out hundreds and thousands and sometimes entire cultures or civilizations of American Indians or early American Indians, besides the Aztecs as well. Then we get to the Inca. The Inca, their capital was Cusco, Peru, which was a small center of one of several competing tribes. So through a series of military victories, Cusco actually became the capital of the Inca Empire. Its origins come from about 1438, when the son of a tribal ruler actually conquered the Chanca peoples. He wanted to assume control from his father, and he actually gave himself the name Pachacuti, which means transformer or shaker of the earth. His goal was to go on and create a full-on empire. So essentially, the Incas were a bunch of small, spread out, non-centralized tribes, and this one guy, Pachacuti, decides that he's going to become the ruler of all of them and unify them into this one big great empire, and he does. When he passes on, his son, Yupanqui, takes control from his father and carries on the same kind of legacy. He expands the empire to the north. Then you have his son, Huayna Capac, who is not really concerned with expanding. He wants to focus more on managing the lands that he currently has from his ancestors, or that he inherited from his ancestors. Their government and their society was a little bit different. The empire of the Incas was split specifically into 4 provinces. Each of these provinces had their own governor and had their own bureaucracy. Their conquered leaders had to demonstrate loyalty, and it was through this loyalty, or through this show of loyalty, that they were then rewarded. They, in contrast to the Aztecs, they did conquer people, but once they conquered a group or a nation or another civilization or tribe near them, these groups did not have to pay tribute. Annually or yearly or whatever. They didn't have to give a payment or a certain amount of money. Instead, they were subject to what was known as the Mita system. The Spaniards are going to later change this, but that's later. Right now, the Inca Mita system consists of what's called mandatory public service. So essentially, every young man between the ages of 15 to 30 has to provide labor or other types of work for the government for a certain amount of time, a fixed amount of time. Kind of like indentured servitude. They have to work for a certain amount of time. However, once that time is up, they cannot be called upon again. They can't serve again or be required to work again. Everybody has to do a certain amount of time, and then that's it. Their government, economy, and their society. So the Inca did require that all conquered peoples adapt to their ways. So this is a little bit different also than the Aztecs. They did establish schools. And in these schools, the people that were conquered were taught the Quechua language, which is the Inca language. They were also taught the Inca religion and history. Conquered people were usually also moved to new lands to weaken their resistance to Inca rule. So the idea is that they move you around so that you don't essentially have kind of like home court advantage. If you're moved around and you're not tied to a certain area, you don't know anybody in this area, you're less likely to rebel or start a rebellion because you're a stranger in a new land. It's also very similar to feudal Europe. They had very few towns, very few markets, and most of the trade that they did was long-distance trade. The economy was based on agriculture. Most of their crops included maize, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, squash, beans, cocoa, and cotton. Most families produced their own food and the clothing. However, they were required to turn over a portion of crops to the ruler. And this is not selfish in terms of rulers speaking. This was done because the ruler wanted to prevent famine, which is a lack of food, from happening. So what they would do is that families would surrender a certain amount of food to these big giant warehouses, think grain silos, if you will, and these warehouses would store crops for a certain amount of time, and so that in case there ever was a drought or there was a famine or something happened and it wiped out their entire harvest, or they had a bad season or something, there was always a backup, and that was a pretty smart move on their part. As far as religion goes, similar to the Aztecs, it's very, very central to their way of being. They also practice royal ancestor veneration. The Incas mummified their dead as well. They believed that the Incan rulers, once mummified, would also continue to rule in the afterlife. And so if you were an Incan ruler, and then you died and you were mummified and sealed up in your palace. And that meant the new Incan ruler, guess what, got to build himself a new fancy palace. It was a motivator for constant expansion because if the dead ruler is still alive ruling in his kingdom, you can't build there, you can't stay there, you have to move and build somewhere else. So these new rulers always got a shiny new house. Inca actually means people of the sun. It comes from Inti, which is the sun god, the most important of the Incan gods. And their rulers, their kings and / priests, head priests, were considered Inti's representatives on earth. Each god also had his or her own temple. Their gods controlled all things, and the priests could then determine the will of the gods by studying arrangements of cocoa leaves or watching the movements of the spider. I know that sounds silly, but I'll explain in a little bit. Priests were also responsible for diagnosing illnesses, predicting the battle of outcomes, solving crimes, and also determining which sacrifices should be made. So sometimes a sacrifice could be something like corn, guinea pigs, or llamas. For the Incan people, those things are sacred and those things are special. You have food and then you have animals that are important to them. Llamas are pretty much the only pack animal that they do have, and so it's one of their labor sources as well. And so if you're taking those things away, that is a sacrifice. Sometimes, in case there was a super serious, event or something really, really intense or harsh, it would call for a human sacrifice. So they did practice human sacrifice like the Aztecs, but on a much, much, much smaller scale. Going back to the priests interpreting these things, how do priests interpret these things? If you are from the Hispanic culture, you will know that we have superstition for everything. So if the spoon falls, company's coming. If somebody sweeps your feet, the women, sorry, you're never getting married. Weird little like colloquialisms or there are things that are idiosyncratic to certain civilizations or cultures. There's a reason for them. Later it would develop into other superstitions. You can't open an umbrella in a house. You break a mirror, you get 7 years bad luck. These priests, it was their job to interpret these signs, and it was in a way the only way that they could explain or understand the things surrounding them. So is it an exact science? No, obviously not. But if you spill salt on a table, I guarantee somebody will probably throw some over their shoulder, depending on, which way it falls. Yeah. All right, so the Incan Road is important. It is the most extensive and advanced transportation system in pre-Columbian South America. It stretches about 39,900 kilometers. That's a mouthful to say. The network is also based on 2 north and south roads with numerous branches. So if you look at the map there, it's one road going north and one road going south, and pretty much stretches all along the coast of South America. Part of the road was built by cultures that actually preceded the Inca Empire, probably the Wari culture. We don't know 100% know for sure, but we know that the building started way back then. And then you also have to remember that all of this was done by hand. The only pack animal they did have was the llama. During the Spanish colonial era, which is when the Europeans arrived, parts of the road system were given the status known as the Camino Real, or the Royal Road, or the King's Highway. And then finally in 2014, it was actually declared a World Heritage Site. The Inca would eventually fall apart with the arrival of the Europeans, so very, again, similar to the Aztecs. Pizarro, or Francisco Pizarro, arrives in 1532. He actually captured the Incan ruler, They placed like a ransom on his head essentially, and they said, fill this room up with gold, and if you fill up this room with gold, we will let your ruler go. And then the Incas did that, and then they killed the king anyway, so it really didn't make a difference. And they would just slowly start to fall apart. Civil war had already weakened them. Diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza were introduced to the people and decimated the population. And then anybody that was survived or that did survive this horrible outbreak of diseases, they were enslaved. So that pretty much is the end of the Incas. Okay, this one's going to go a little bit faster, I think. You have state building now in Africa, which is key concept 1.5. So pre-1200, Africa is before Islam came to Africa. The societies in this area were extremely diverse, and that's because they were pretty much all separated. They were all tribal. They all were decentralized, and they had their own way of doing things. They were animistic as well, so they believed that everything had spirits. Some of them were polytheistic, so they worshipped many, many different gods. They also had different kinds of economies, and that's because Africa is rich in a lot of different things: gold, salt, spices, animals, and things like that. And so trading was very, very important to these people. Most of the people in this area spoke the Bantu language. That is because the Bantu people migrated and spread their language, but they also spread their knowledge of metalwork and agriculture throughout Africa. So the picture that you guys see there shows the origination of the Bantu peoples kind of being somewhere along the West African coast and then expanding and spreading out to all different parts of Africa. So Bantu was probably the most common language. I did mention that they were stateless society, so they did not have an organized or centralized government. They were largely weak with no tax systems or no large buildings. Islam pretty much would change this, because when Islam came to Africa, it came through missionaries, and many of them converted to Islam because Islam was considered an egalitarian religion. Everybody was equal. Yes, there was focus or authority on the king, whoever was in charge of the caliphate at this time, of the kingdom, but everybody else was uniform or of the same. And these early tribal societies, it was not that case. People were put into certain classes and certain social groupings. And so with the arrival of Islam, you do see a chance for people to have some semblance of equality. Conversion also gave them equal footing in terms of comparing them to Arabic societies, which is another society that they traded with, and they wanted to be seen on the same level with them as well. Trade in some kingdoms. So the trade in Africa really centered around the trans-Saharan trade. Trade eventually was improved by the use of camels, the camel saddle, and caravans. We talked about all three in class. Camels can go for long periods of time without water. They can also drink water extremely fast. The camel saddle helps alleviate the weight. So early camel saddles were pretty much just to make sure the riders could stay on, and then later they developed that more advanced camel saddle that could actually balance the weight, and so it made it easier for the distribution of weight for these camels to be able to carry very, very heavy loads. And then caravans, which are just long lines of people and animals as well, that would stop every so often at caravanseries for food supplies and other things like that. This allowed the trade networks to grow and expand and be able to trade with each other. Some pretty notable kingdoms in the West African Empire are going to be Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. So on the map you can kind of see them right there, in the purple shaded area. They became Islamic to grow politically. They traded with other Muslim nations, and then they would eventually set up tributary systems on a small scale. In Central Africa, Islam did not spread to this region, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that it was extremely difficult to travel there. So in Central Africa, you're going to see states form a lot more slowly than you would versus coastal areas or areas that directly fall along the trans-Saharan trade routes or sub-routes. Great Zimbabwe is another important kingdom, large and also non-Islamic. They would become important and they would take over this area or territory because they are going to dominate the African gold and trading on the coastal ports in the Indian Ocean network. And they would also have to build a wall for themselves for protection. So Indian Ocean, we'll mention it later. I think we will, probably on Thursday. But the Indian Ocean, remember, people like to travel on the Indian Ocean because once they could figure out the monsoon winds, traveling was a lot easier for them, and so it made trade a lot more efficient and effective. So some pictures. You have what looks like a caravansary. I mentioned these things. They're in the desert. They are spread out, usually about 100 miles away from each other. And that's because, again, camels can go about 100 miles without dying. Pobrecitos. They're like mini hotels in the desert, place for the animals to rest and the people to rest, and then also for trading to happen. The picture that's up there is what is, I think, and I want to say the legendary city of Timbuktu. So Timbuktu and Gao are going to be two cities in the Kingdom of Ali that become very, very important for trade and wealth, but also for studying and education. They become centers of learning. And so Timbuktu becomes one of those centers for learning as well. You have Ethiopia. Ethiopia becomes a link between the Arab and the Mediterranean world, and that's because of where it was located, the access to the sea. It was also exposed to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Ethiopia is going to retain a lot of strong ties to Christianity. It's one of the biggest Christian kingdoms in Africa, if not the biggest. It's also becomes very, very wealthy, because of the proximity to Eurasia, so Europe and Asia, and so it becomes very wealthy because due to trade. Some notable rulers during this time in Africa are going to be one, Sundiata. I mentioned his story in class. People sometimes think that this is where the Lion King story comes from, because his nickname was the Lion Prince. His father was king of his tribe, of his area, and his father was killed when rival groups kind of invaded the area. They also killed most of the royal family as well in an attempt to capture the throne. However, Sundiata was young and he was crippled, and so when these rival groups show up, they don't bother killing him because they don't even consider him a threat. Sundiata kind of goes away or disappears for a while, gets training, comes back, and reclaims his kingdom as this Lion Prince. He reclaims his kingdom and takes the throne, and he becomes a very, very efficient, very effective ruler. Then you have Mansa Musa, who's probably more famous than Sundiata. He's Sundiata's grandnephew. Mansa Musa is extremely, extremely wealthy, beyond wealthy. He is known also for his religious leadership, as well as his political and economic accomplishments. It's a long video, guys. You guys know I start to stumble at the end, and so we're almost done. He was extremely devout Muslim. He began a pilgrimage to Mecca in about 1324 to go to the Holy City, because all Muslims are expected to go to the city as part of the Pillars of Faith. And along this way, think, the movie Aladdin, that scene where he's just throwing out coins and tossing all these things, and he's traveling with the elephants and the camels and the peacocks and all these riches and stuff like that. That was Mansa Musa. He just was dripping in gold, and so extremely, extremely, extremely wealthy, but also extremely generous, because his devotion to Islam pretty much reached no bounds. When he returned upon his home and returning upon the areas that he traveled, he built schools in Timbuktu, he built mosques in other trading cities, and he also would sponsor people who wanted to continue their religious studies in other places. So while he was very, very rich, he was also very, very generous. And there's a picture of Sundiata, the Lion Prince, and Mansa Musa on one of the old school maps, King of Gold, basically. Okay, exit ticket. It's already uploaded on Google Classroom, so again, I'm not going to explain it. I just want to see you guys' responses. We're doing this the first week, so seeing what you guys can read and interpret from the DBQ source. So this DBQ source is about Africa. Read it, figure out what it's trying to say, and then your job is to answer the 2 questions. So the 2 questions, again, are already uploaded onto Google Classroom. Make sure you submit those. I want to say I put the deadline by April 9th, which gives you about a 2-day window. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at any time. Hope you guys are doing well. Bye for now. And then, make sure you do the work. Bye.